Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on cybersecurity and ransomware. As resourceful as the internet can be, there can be threats and hazards tied to our digital lives. These threats not only affect us as individuals, but they also can hurt the places that we work for and rely on for daily resources. Recently, two major companies, Colonial Pipeline and JBS Foods, were hit by a specific type of cyber attack. Their systems were locked down unless they paid a ransom, and the lockdowns put limits on distributing gasoline and processing meat, affecting people across the country. And now, experts say these ransomware attacks are increasing, not only in number, but also in sophistication. So tonight we are talking about what got us here and what you can do to protect yourself from these types of hacks. Kicking off our conversation tonight live via Zoom is Dr. Mu Zhang, Assistant Professor of Computer Science at the University of Utah. And Dr. Zhang, thank you so much for being here. We'd like to rewind back a few years. What did ransomware and cybersecurity look like before 2017?
So in fact, ransomware is not a new concept, right? So the first ransomware attacks can date back to even in the 1980s, right? But just like the physical crimes of extortion, the hardest part of this crime is actually how to collect a ransom. Right? This has also been a headache for the digital ransomware attackers. Right? Therefore, in the old days, ransomware authors will have to provide the victims with a real bank account, right, so that they can receive a ransom. And this bank account, right, real bank account, can be easily traceable, right? So that's why in old days, the attackers usually do not ask for a big amount of a ransom.
That is so interesting. I can't believe it's been happening since the 1980s. Professor, could you refresh us on the 2017 WannaCry hack? What was stolen and how does it relate to the last two massive infrastructure cyber attacks of JBS Meats and Colonial Pipeline?
Basically in 2017, there was this very significant attack, right, called the WannaCry ransomware attack. So it actually has affected more than 200,000 computers all over the world, right? So in more than 150 countries, right? So what makes this WannaCry special? What makes it different from the previous ransomware attacks is that it actually used an exploit or a hacker tool called Eternal Blue, which was actually developed by National Security Agency, NSA. So what happened was that NSA discovered these zero-day vulnerabilities in Windows operating systems, but instead of disclosing this information, they actually weaponized it, right, make it a hacker tool. But somehow this hacker tool was leaked, right, to a hacker group, which was eventually used to propagate this WannaCry ransomware. Another thing that makes this WannaCry different is that it actually demanded a ransom payment in Bitcoin cryptocurrency. So this Bitcoin network is supposed to be anonymous, right? Meaning you cannot easily correlate an account in the Bitcoin network to a real-world entity, right? So the usage of the Bitcoin network actually provides the attackers with a convenient and safe way for them to collect ransoms. But in this particularly attacks, as well as the recent attacks, I would not say the ransomware actually steal anything, right? I mean, of course they can, right? So there are different types of ransomware, but here, right, particularly in this WannaCry attacks and the attacks against this Colonial Pipeline as well as the JBS, right? Instead of stealing data, what they actually do is they encrypt the data, right? So they aimed to block the access to some critical data. So what they do is they encrypt the data, and only if the victim can pay a ransom, right, they will decrypt it, right, making it available again.
So interesting. Dr. Zhang, can you talk about how those companies resolved the attack, specifically in the WannaCry attack? Did they end up paying the ransom?
So for WannaCry attack, right, so although the law enforcement was strongly against paying ransom, it was reported that eventually the attackers still managed to collect more than 100,000, a little bit more than 100,000 US dollars. It's actually not a big amount comparing to that of the recent attacks, where the Colonial Pipeline actually has paid 4.4 million, while the GBS is said to have paid 11 million US dollars. And so there's this difference here, right, in terms of how companies responded to this kind of attacks. But partly because the malware is evolving, right? So in fact, in the WannaCry attacks, there's actually some implementation flaws in this malware, and therefore the security researchers can quickly identify those flaws and get it resolved.
Now, Dr. Zhang, we have about 30 seconds left. Before we go to break, I want to address this question. President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin just had a summit where they talked about these cyber attacks and ransomware. Do countries have any ability to control this activity?
I believe so. So as I mentioned, so the digital ransomware attacks are very similar to the traditional physical extortion, where although they can actually use cyber measures to demand for a ransom, they still need to collect ransoms, transfer funds, and eventually to be able to use them. Right. So those are actually the places where governments, law enforcement can jump in, right? Especially for modern ransomware attacks, where ransom is actually paid through Bitcoin network, right, which is highly distributed. So this means the international collaborations is very much desired to capture this kind of a fund transfer.
Well, that definitely answers a question that's been on a lot of people's minds. Dr. Zhang, hold that thought. We have to take a quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on cybersecurity and ransomware. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on cybersecurity and ransomware. We pick up now from our last segment with Dr. Mu Zhang, Assistant Professor of Computer Science at the University of Utah. Dr. Zhang, thank you for staying with us. How concerned are you about this cyber attack and ransomware activity? And how concerned should regular average citizens be?
So I would say as individuals, I don't think we need to worry too much about this kind of attacks. This is because, after all, the goal for this particular type of attacks, ransomware attacks, is to make profit. And therefore, they usually just targeted at high-profile companies, right, big organizations. Right? Well, on the other hand, individuals are not usually the target for this type of attacks. But of course, we are the customers of those companies, so our daily lives will definitely get affected.
Well, that definitely provides some relief to the individual citizen. But for big companies, paying a ransom can be a very difficult decision. Can you talk about the factors that may go into a business's decision, like maybe the type of business affected or the cost to repair the system?
I think this really depends on the nature of the data being attacked and the nature of the work where this data is used. Right? So in fact, all these companies, they have backup data. Right? So even if their data in use is encrypted, is not available, they can still restore the data from their backups. But the restoration process is very time consuming. Therefore, there's usually a time gap between when the attack happens and the data is restored from their backup. So the question here actually is, can you afford this system downtime? Right? Can you afford this service disruption? So definitely there is, this is a hard decision to make. So for example, in the WannaCry attacks, right? So one of the major victims is actually the British National Health Service, right? British NHS. So many of their medical devices were affected, but they didn't pay the ransom because they have a backup plan, and they managed to continue their service, right, even without the support of the computers, support of the critical data in their computers, right? But just because they didn't pay the ransom does not necessarily mean there's no financial loss. right? So in fact, in this WannaCry attacks, although the attackers eventually just collected a little bit more than 100,000 US dollars, but the financial loss caused by these attacks is estimated to be more than 4 billion US dollars. And the financial loss is only one aspect, one factor. There are some even more critical factors. Right? For example, just imagine what if the critical control data in a nuclear plant is encrypted, is not available. Right? So losing access to this kind of data means you basically lose control over the nuclear reactors. Right? That's a totally different level of threats. Right? So depending on this different nature of the data, so we may need to make some trade-offs. So personally, I don't have any recommendation. I would say we need to listen to the professionals, for example, the law enforcement, right, who are experts in terms of dealing with this kind of crimes.
Right, there are so many factors here to weigh, and it's just so unique to each individual company and what they have to consider. Dr. Zhang, how do these hacks normally happen?
So in terms of the infection process, right, infecting the victim machines, I would say the ransomware is not very different from all other malware instances, malware attacks. So usually what happens is that the attackers will first try to find the vulnerabilities in a victim system, right, in their software system, and then they will try to create hacker tools, or in other words, the exploits, so that they can leverage those vulnerabilities to get into the victim systems. Eventually, they want to get very high privilege in the system so that they can do whatever they want. To do so, usually they will use social engineering. For example, they can send a fake email to an IT administrator in a company. So in this email, it can contain some malicious attachment or some malicious links. So they will craft the language to trick the receiver, this victim administrator, to click on those malicious components so as to trigger the malware. So these are basically very common practices for attackers.
Yeah, Dr. Zhang, 30 seconds left. Anything people can do at home to protect themselves?
So because this malware infection process, it's not very different from that in all other cyber attacks. So what we need to do is just basically what we have been doing against all other cyber attacks, right? For example, we need to use security best practices, right? Use caution when you open a unrecognized or suspicious email, right? So use security software, antivirus, firewall, right? Keep your system up to date, installing all those security patches, and all other security practices like two-factor authentication, changing your password regularly. So all sounds like a cliche, but they can be very effective if you just strictly follow the practice.
I think the point that we're trying to drill home here is anyone can be a victim, and whether you notice it or not, there are traps everywhere when you're online, through your email, the websites you use, your phone. Very helpful information tonight. You've been hearing from Dr. Mu Zhang, Assistant Professor of Computer Science at the University of Utah. And Dr. Zhang, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate your expertise and advice. We'll be right back. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on cybersecurity and ransomware. One way businesses can protect themselves is to purchase insurance in case they are the victims of a ransomware attack. Rounding out our discussion tonight, live in studio, is Matt Child, who is the CEO of Utah Independent Agents, which represents and advocates for the Insurance Industry Association of Utah. And Matt, we appreciate you so much for being here tonight. Let's start out with talking about how things were a few years ago. How were businesses and insurance companies thinking about hacks and cybersecurity a few years ago?
The insurance industry has known about the problem for a long, long time. Ever since the advent of the internet in the early 90s, we've known about digital transfer of information, and we've been able to handle it for a long time. They've developed products to help protect businesses and help protect consumers and their information. So it's something they've had available for protections for quite a number of decades now.
Now, some companies offer insurance for employee kidnappings? Am I read that right?
Yeah, they've been for international travel. They've had that for a long time.
So does the insurance industry look at cyber attacks and ransomware in the same way?
Not really. I think we use the word ransom. It's an interesting parallel to use that same term, but it's interesting because they're using that word because we're holding the company's information hostage. And so we're holding it for ransom, essentially. So just like your previous guest said, that they're holding that, whether it's encrypted or they're holding it hostage, and so they're keeping that information and they're requiring money to release that information so they can then use it again as it's intended. And so they're requiring that, whether it be cryptocurrency or some other payment, in order to release that money for the business to use it again. And so it's a very similar process that the hacker or the person that's keeping that information away from the business for its intended use. So it's the same type of process that's being done, and products are not the same, but it's developed very similarly.
Right. Now, has there been any actual work or cost-benefit analysis on the ransomware attacks? In other words, is paying ransom cheaper than rebuilding the system?
Really, as far as the data analytics and the actuarial numbers, that's what insurance is really driven by, is to evaluate the cost to charge the consumer, or in this case the company, how much the policy should charge or cost them to purchase. When we're looking at how much to charge the consumer for their policy, we look at the risk analysis, how much exposure will be there for the policy. And so when we're looking at that, that's looking at the overall exposure, how much that should cost. And so that's where the data analytics are put together to derive at the cost of the policy. Now, the individual business can look at their overall cost of whether or not they buy the policy, or whether or not they pay the ransom, or do they go through all the other costs associated with not paying the ransom. Do they rebuild their database? Do they deal with loss of consumer confidence? Do they rebuild their websites? Do they rebuild their communication platform? Do they rebuild all the things that are associated with losing their communications platform because they're not paying the ransom? In most cases, they really should just buy a cybersecurity policy that includes ransom coverage. And if they don't have one, contact an independent agent in the state of Utah right now and buy a policy so they're protected. Make sure they have the security platforms in place so they are qualified for one, and make sure they're protected right now.
Very helpful tips. What are you seeing right now with cybersecurity insurance? Are they becoming more common, or maybe more in depth with their language, and are they getting expensive?
They're really overall not very expensive. They're very available, so agents can buy them, or companies can buy them from their independent agents. It depends on the type of business they are as far as their cost, just like your cars, right? If you have a very sensible, not a very expensive car, not high performance car, your insurance for that car doesn't cost as much. You have a very high performance car, that costs a lot of money. You have a high risk business that does a lot of transactions and has a lot of clientele information, your cyber policy may cost a lot more money. But generally speaking, your cyber policies, for the coverage it provides, not a lot of money. So you definitely want to buy that cyber policy to protect not only your business, but your consumer's business. And really, it costs a lot less when you look at the cost of the policy versus how much coverage you get. Man, it's a really great buy. And so you really need to buy it and really protect your business from the damage it will cause long term.
Right, and I think you don't want to be in that position where it's happened to you and you didn't have the insurance coverage and then you regret not having it.
Yeah.
Matt, we have about a minute left. What do you recommend for companies and individuals in terms of protecting themselves?
As far as companies are concerned, they need to contact their independent agent, have a comprehensive review of their insurance policies, make sure they have all the coverages that they need, from liability all the way through to cybersecurity, through their business, personal property, through their premises liability, through everything, to make sure they have all the coverages they need to protect not only themselves, but their employees and their consumers. From the individual consumers, make sure they do businesses with reputable businesses. Make sure that they're interacting with the right businesses that do businesses the right way. And as we're dealing with a lot of virtual environments, especially due to COVID, we're kind of transitioning to a lot of virtual environments here. Make sure that if you're working with a business that now does business only through the internet, make sure that they've protected themselves. Make sure that they're doing business the right way, that they've got a cyber policy. So if their data is breached, that they have the right amount of coverage to make sure that their data is recoverable, that your consumer's data is also protected, that your business is not exposed because they don't have the right coverage, that they can then protect your consumer data. With the virtual environment that we're in, there's a chain that happens because of the internet. It doesn't just stop with you, it goes over and over and over again, and we need to make sure that is protected as we interact with one another over the internet.
Yeah, this is all news that you can use, folks, and you've been hearing from Matt Child, who is the CEO of Utah Independent Agents. And Matt, thank you so much for being here tonight. You provided so much great information.
Thank you.